How this will work tonight is certainly if you have things you want to bring up, then you'll do that. When it gets to about 10 minutes to the hour, I have a case study that we'll look at and discuss kind of based off of the book and see if we can unpack that a little bit. But this is not just me talking at you. So, as you have read things or something happens, then I want you to dialogue with us to see what you came about with this. I just want to confess to you, I've gone to a lot of district assemblies, and especially as lead pastor, I was always frustrated when they would put all the stats out on the handbook. And I've been that person that went to district assembly and I didn't have a good year. My numbers were down, and I would take that personal. And then I would feel like, boy, I'm not doing that great. And it's been easy for me in ministry to play this comparison game of other churches and feeling like our church isn't as effective. And I confess to you, I've gone to some of these conferences that Carl has listed and have kind of bought into this idea. If I implement this one bullet idea, then this is going to be the magic key that will turn everything around. And I'm thankful that I've came back to churches and boards and said, if we do all of these things, I just went to this conference, we can turn the ship around. And they were very kind and gracious, but those things never turned out to be mega churches that I had envisioned in my head. And there's a couple of things I appreciate about this author. One thing that I appreciate, of course, is that he doesn't just bash on big churches, because I think it's easy for us to look at mega churches, look at the larger churches, and say, well, they're disconnected from real ministry. And that's a dangerous path to go down, to where we're really almost disgruntled and mock them. But I think what I appreciate is he says there's value for large churches and there's also value in small churches. Let's take a look at this book here. And I kind of want to open up with the very beginning. And I'm on page 3. Mine's a paperback version of it. And page 3 on my book says this: I've been one of those struggling pastors. I'm still in many ways, and received some very helpful ideas from those conferences and books. Years ago, when I started attending them, the leaders in my church always knew when I had been to one, because I'd come home all revved up about the latest idea, convinced this was the key to getting our church to the next level. Sometimes I'd take the principles I'd learned and reteach them to my staff and volunteers. If a book was particularly good, I'd make it required reading for them, and then we'd gather around and talk about it. Some church leaders would catch the same vision I had caught, but some would drag their heels. The conference had told us about the heel draggers, so I was prepared. They were the problem people, the vision killers, the we've never done it this way before crowd. I was not going to let them get me down as I boldly stepped out in the fresh new way of doing church. But somehow I could never duplicate the success of the pastor who gave the seminar or wrote the book. After a few months of excitement, energy, and expense, one or two ideas would make their way into our church's culture, but most would fade away from lack of interest. The book, with all the answers, would drift from my desk to shelf to my closet, and I would quietly blame the heel draggers for killing God's vision. Does that resonate with anyone? Anyone can empathize with that kind of book? I think that many of us, we've been around. Joe shaking his head no. He's never been discouraged. God bless Joe for always being on top of it. Yeah, I mean, I think that resonates with some of us. Let's jump over the next page, the page number 4, kind of right in the middle of that paragraph. It says, the last sentence of the middle paragraph says, the mega church pastors looked like giants. The giants felt like enemies, and I seemed like a grasshopper in my own eyes. Then, if you jump over to page 5, the first full paragraph says, yes, they do. The problem is that too many of us have defined church success and health by numbers, and not just by any numbers, by two specific numbers: butts in the seats and bucks in the offering. The higher, the better. This obsession with numerical growth is not healthy. And I guess the where we want to start with this conversation is, how do you feel about the numbers that we have to produce? I mean, you know it. You have to, at the end of the year, give reports to boards, to the denomination. I mean, we fill these things out. and it can be a metric, but sometimes it becomes kind of the basis of true fruit and success. And I think we all know numerical growth isn't always the key to that. So, what do you do with growth numbers? How do you balance that as pastors? Anyone want to dig in?
Well, I think coming from Central Cal, I think they were trying. I mean, you always have to report numbers to the denomination, but I
Yeah,
remember in my first church getting started, of course, you go to all the conferences and you go through that for a while, then you realize this is nuts. But then also, you would go to conferences and they'd say things like, it's not about the numbers, not about, and so they tell you that, but then they turn around and say, by the way, you need to tell us all
right,
your numbers, and that's really
right,
what we're interested in. So it's kind of like, yeah, it's what I heard someone say, what you inspect is what you expect. And so you inspect numbers, that's what the priority is.
yeah,
Um, but I think so. I have seen leadership though try. So I started to talk about Central Cal. So they try to focus more on stories that were happening
mm,
in local churches as opposed to just how many numbers you got, I guess. Maybe they were trying to, because it's really hard to measure. We all know that. It's
yeah,
how do you
yeah,
measure, how do you measure the spiritual growth of individuals? I have a lot of stories of people that, from over years, you see them at one point and then a decade later, they've had all these things happen in their life. But how do you report that, measure? I mean, you can tell a story, but
right,
that's one story of one person. And so it sounds like one story of one person, but the reality is that represents years of fruitful ministry to where there have been these incremental growth in that person or in multiple people's lives.
yeah,
But you can't really write a report about every little incremental change that this person came and they told me this story of how God was working in their life. Okay, but so anyway, it is a challenge, but um, so it's just part of that getting our identity, I guess, of what's really going on.
yeah,
I think we have to remember too that it's a part of the game, and I don't mean that in a trite way, but if we were all zookeepers, we'd be wondering how many elephants did we have?
yeah,
So
right,
there are ways that we keep track. And you talk to anybody, you go to General Assembly, you go to any of these events, and you start talking to your friends. How many people you got? And that's just a part of, it's an
yeah,
identifier for us, I guess. And that's how I've learned to think about it, because yes, early on it was discouraging. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is ridiculous. But
yeah,
as I've grown in ministry, I don't, you may not have the numerical year that you'd hope to have,
right,
like uh, uh, like Ronnie said, you have people's lives that are being changed. That how do you weigh that out? Which is more important? We want to see people's lives changed. I think that's what we've been called to do. I remember
yeah,
sitting in a huge church for a conference in Indianapolis, and the executive pastor was talking to us. He said, everybody gets caught up on numbers. He says, the bigger the church, the bigger the numbers. This
yeah,
particular church needed $500,000 a week to stay in budget. So you begin to say, well, think about that problem. I'm
yeah,
thankful I don't have
right,
that issue to deal with too. So
yeah,
he said it's adding zeros.
yeah, yeah,
To so everybody's got stuff, and I really appreciated that guy that he taught. He said, yeah, we're huge, and but we also have all kinds of problems. We might even have more than
yeah,
you.
sure, yeah,
Um, So, not speaking strictly from a pastoral perspective, because I've not been a pastor but of one church, but I've been on many, many church boards. Um,
Yeah.
it's always a struggle. And the thing that I have to keep coming back to, so in my previous life, numbers were very important to me just because I was an engineer.
Yeah.
But at some point in time, there's a statistical significance, and we really have to start. None of us are statisticians, so if a church of 10 loses one person, that's 10%. But if a church of 1,000 loses one person, it's not nearly as large of a percent. It's
Right.
statistically insignificant. And
Sure.
so when you start dealing with numbers, you have to think about those things. I think personally, counting heads is important, counting bucks is important. When you start rolling that up to higher levels, district levels, region levels, national levels, international levels, those types of things, then you can start looking at statistically significant trends. What's
Yeah.
going on? How are things happening? What's the overall health? But at the local level, the overall health of a church, I don't think the numbers can be statistically significant. So that's just my thought.
Yeah. No, that's good. Turn to page 41 with me. The second paragraph is interesting to me. And really, he's talking about the size of the American church. And again, you have to keep in mind this is written pre-COVID, even so. There's been some decline, I think, even since then of attendance. But page 41 says 93% of American churches under 350 are small, while 80% under 200 are very small. If size equals success, then 93% of pastors are unsuccessful, bad at their jobs, and inadequate at fulfilling their calling, while 80% are very bad at their jobs. A number escapes being part of, but barely. And I think you're catching what he's saying is the majority of churches are under 200. It's not the normal to be a church over 200. I found it interesting. I was in a meeting with brand new district superintendents in Kansas City, and the conversation came about of what do you do with churches that are running 10, 15, 20 people? How long do you keep them going? And there was almost this spirit in the air of saying, well, close them, close them. You know, if churches aren't more than 15 or 20, they're not being effective. And Stan Reeder happened to be in the room, and they asked Stan, "What do you think about that?" And Stan said, "In this cycle of resurgence, which I hope that you're aware of, this whole idea of blessing people and reaching out to the community and then becoming disciples." He says the growth that we're seeing is really coming from our churches 50 and under. And he says most Nazarene churches are 50 and under. And so when you start talking about wanting to just close a church because they're only running 20, he goes, really, this is the majority of the churches who we are. And I think there's almost become this um, sense of there's been so much focus on the bigger churches of the saddlebacks of the world that we almost think, well, that's normal. And then the reality is that there's not really this normal of there's a lot of really big churches, but the reality is there's more of small churches. Do you feel that in your congregations? I guess I know that people that came to my communities, they would move from bigger towns and they're frustrated because they would come from church of 1,000 and then they come to my church of 100 and go, "Oh, we don't like this because it doesn't have as many programs, as many things going for it." I mean, do you sense that our people think that there's a lot of big churches out there when there's maybe not necessarily those out there like perhaps the public thinks? Mhm. Let me rephrase this question then. Do you feel? Oh, I cut you off, Dave. You're about to say something.
Well, I did, here in Alaska, I think what we see, the vast majority of churches are size. Anchorage has a couple of what would be considered large churches, but
Right.
most people that we we minister to here. At least that's my experience. They come from a church of similar size or smaller or bigger, but not
Yeah.
much.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
down in the lower 48, those were the comments. Sure, I heard those. Wow,
Sure.
you guys don't have, this or you don't have that. Well, down the street, I can get this or that. So the shopper mentality maybe is a little different here.
Yeah. And yet, I guess I want to ask this question. Do you feel the pressure of now that everything is out there online, do you find that a lot of people are listening to pastors now? Because I mean, there's so many good podcasts. So I mean, I'd have people in my church that they would listen to Andy Stanley's sermon before they came to my church, and it's like, man, don't tell me that. I don't want to try to compare myself with Andy. I mean, people that were big Francis Chan fans, so they would listen to Francis Chan, and then there's like almost this expectation of how am I ever going to compete and preach against that kind of thing? I mean, that's a shift I feel like that's happened that wasn't there in the beginning days before everything was online. Do you feel that in your congregations, or that's not as much of a factor where you're ministering at?
I think it's just a totally misconstrued thought process myself.
Yeah,
If I'm just going to assume people that like attend whatever church they attend, and prior to that are watching whoever other people online, I'm going to
yeah,
assume that they're pretty dialed into their Christian faith. So in that sense, not to say it in a negative way, but like I don't really care.
right, right,
That like they have a relationship with Christ. Watch 1,000 pastors all you want. Doesn't matter to me. The concern is
right.
who are the people that, because nobody, at least I don't think, a very small percentage of people who don't have a relationship with Christ, I doubt if they're going online and scrolling a bunch of sermons that pastors preach, no matter how flashy and attractive they are.
Right. Yeah. Oh, when you get to chapter 5, I find it interesting, uh, this analogy that he has of IKEA and Starbucks. I find that to be a very helpful illustration in my mind because he talks about IKEA is a massive building, thousands and thousands of square foot, and it's designed that way. It carries a lot of bulk, it carries a lot of things. And then you notice he talks about Starbucks, which is, less than, most of them are less than 1,000 square feet. And yet both are very profitable. Both are very effective in who they are. And the last thing that Starbucks would say is, what we need to do is we need to have a big IKEA building, and then we'd be effective. Because it just doesn't make any sense. That's not who they are. It's not what they're doing. Uh, I personally loved, in August. I was at Two Rivers with Pastor Bob, and I am convinced that if Pastor Bob had a church that ran 5,000, Two Rivers would not want that. That would not be effective at all. And his church really is a community church. I mean, I would sit and listen to how many people he talks about that would stop by, that would support and give money to his church, that may not even walk into the foot of his church, but he's deeply entrenched in the community, and he is effective in what he's doing. But his church is never going to be the same size as Change Point in Anchorage. It's never going to be this massive facility. And I don't, there's no reason that Bob should feel bad for that. I'm kind of picking on Bob for a minute, but I think you understand the heart of what I'm saying is I would certainly not say that Bob is any less effective at Two Rivers as a place like Saddleback or something like that. I mean, how does this analogy help? Does that resonate with you? What do you think about this IKEA Starbucks kind of situation? And then let's take it one step further, because another illustration that's helpful is the shepherd rancher mentality that he talks about, where he talks about there's ranchers that they're just, they pour into leaders versus shepherds that are more one-on-one, and the shepherd kind of knows a little bit more intimately the sheep. And I don't think he's saying ranchers are disconnected from the church, but there's a different style. So talk to me about these different styles of IKEA, Starbucks, rancher, shepherd. What do you take away from that?
I related it to something he said earlier in the beginning of the book, that churches should discover what God's purpose is for them,
Yeah.
then minister according to that purpose. And that's what we,
Yeah.
when God laid it on our hearts about the community and all the needs that are there. And so we looked for the needs, and then we just went with it to fulfill those needs. And
Mhm.
yeah,
I resonated more with the Shepherd Rancher thing than I did the IKEA Starbucks thing. And
Okay.
um, I recognized in my own life I was trying to do more ranch stuff in
Yeah.
the last year or two because I was trying to raise up people in our congregation to take responsibility. One of the things that every single pastoral review, they always said, Pastor, let other people do. So I've been letting other people do. But the
Yeah.
reality is people want their pastor to come to their home and pray with them. They want their
Yeah.
pastor to be at the
Yeah.
hospital. They want their pastor. And so it's an interest. I just, that really gave me pause to think about what I'm doing and whether or not I needed to think differently about trying to get other people to step up into roles and how that needs to look.
Yeah.
I think over the years I've seen cultural change of uh, you know, people do want the pastor around, and I think maybe they want you in their home sometimes. But over my years, uh, I was in people's homes all the time,
Mhm.
and there was a lot of socializing. There was a lot of uh, entertaining in homes. And then as the years have gone by, that's gotten less. In my previous church in California, it, just kind of as the years went by, it just seemed like people were not as comfortable. They would rather meet in restaurants. So I guess
Mm.
the shepherding is still there.
Yeah.
Like even my last church in California, they didn't want potlucks because they didn't trust each other's kitchens, how clean their kitchens were. So they wanted everything to be catered. And so that's
Yeah.
just that culture of, you know, just the sense of, hey, we just like being together, or are we concerned about, is your kitchen, you have cats in your house? I don't want you cooking for me for my
Mm.
potluck.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I heard a lot of that. So it has been more of a challenge to just feel welcome to just drop in, and maybe that's just me, but I've kind of picked up on those signals. And I think
Yeah.
actually I would like to get over that and just say, hey, I mean, maybe you're uncomfortable or not, but I just want that engagement. And that's kind of that real shepherding kind of thing that sometimes I miss, that openness.
I think for being a staff pastor, the
Yeah.
whole rancher shepherd thing was eye opening for me because I've had both as senior pastors. And I'm realizing the pastors I did the best with fit with who I was. And the ones that I struggled with I'm more of a shepherd and they were more ranchers. And so it was hard to mesh how we
Mm.
worked because we just looked at things in such a different way.
Mhm.
So I never thought about some of these things as a staff pastor. So it was nice to read this book and understand the different things that you guys face that
Yeah.
maybe I don't see all the time, but also understand how I fit into that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I come at it from a little different perspective, being in the hospital and chaplaincy. But
Yeah.
what I would say is that, and one of the pastors mentioned this earlier, is that when people are sick, a lot of times they want their pastor. But I will say that there is something about and this, it was more in Spokane than it is here, larger churches that had trained up individuals within their churches to come and to do ministry in the hospital when they had families or patients that were in there. And there's something about how do we empower the church? I think that's almost the question, right? Because like I have two boys, they're in 11th grade and ninth grade. How am I empowering them to be the church now? And so part of it is we have to be ranchers. Like I know my boys, but I also, part of my responsibility as like a man of God is to help them live into action in the world. And I think that like the shepherd rancher thing, the hard thing I had with it is, so I'm like one was like really knowing your people, the other is kind of this overarching leading a little bit. And so that was just my thoughts. Is I do agree that a lot of times when people are sick, they want, like they say, oh, anybody is good, but they do want their their
Yeah.
pastor in that moment. But there is something to be said is how, as leaders, as pastors, as ranchers, whoever it is, like how are we making sure that we empower like those around us, the church, to
Yeah.
live into its full gifting?
In the military, we used to call that situational leadership. I don't think it's right for any of us to be explicitly or exclusively a shepherd, or any of us to be exclusively a rancher. I think we have to live in both worlds. And I think that's kind of what Joel was talking about there a little bit in terms of
Mhm.
knowing when to be the rancher, when to be the shepherd. Um, and Hunter, you may talk about this later, but in a chapter later on in the book, I want to say it's towards like 11 or 12, it talks about the difference in mentality between a top-down leadership and a
Right.
flat type of a flat approach. And
Mhm.
not to say that either one of those is right or wrong. It's just there's certain
Yeah.
times when we have to have a flat leadership, and there's certain times that we have to have a top-down leadership, and we have to be fluent and somewhat capable in both of those, I think.
Yeah.
I'm smiling because, and Steve, that's well said, because as pastors, you talk about being all things to all people, right? Like, we're meeting the expectations of however many people we meet all the time. And so, that's really well said about how just we practice, a lot of wisdom and discernment in this dynamic space where we're leading.
Yeah.
Yeah, to add on to that, I think we all are shepherds and we all are ranchers. We step into that role. I had a pastor when I was in college, and he had staff, and he found himself that he was a rancher all the time. And he told me, he says, "I'm tired of being a rancher. I want to be a
Mm.
shepherd. I want to go and spend time with people in my church and have meals with people that are part of the church, not just my staff." So I thought it's interesting that as we're talking about this, it's easy to fall into one or the other a little bit more, or maybe we have tendencies for that. That we feel more called to one or the other. But like Steve and Joel have said, I think we fill both roles in ministry as leaders.
Because it feels like there's two problems. I mean, one disconnect is a rancher doesn't know the heart of the people, and you can be disconnected. But I mean, I've also seen it where a pastor has been such a shepherd that when they finally retire or they leave, the whole thing falls apart. And they have done so much that it's almost like the church can't figure out how to function. And so yeah, I hear what we're saying. Like there's got to be a balance in all of it.
I think that there's a time and a place for both. I wanted to highlight one of the things that I highlighted in chapter 5 on page
Yeah.
57. It just
Mhm.
says, one reason people go to small churches is that smaller size allows them to have a more personal stake in what happens, and they know that they matter. And I think that that's what people want a lot of times, is that personal connection, and they want to feel like they matter and that they have a voice and that they can be heard and that people can hear them and have an opportunity, that the pastor, the shepherd, can shepherd them specifically and know who they are, and that they can be heard and validated for who they are. And so I think there's a time and place for both the shepherd and the rancher. And we have to use discernment to determine when it's best to act in each type of manner as a leader in a leadership position.
Yeah, that's good. I think to add to what you're saying, Mindy, I mean, it seems to me, and I appreciate, I can't remember where in the book, but I mean, it's almost like the smaller churches give opportunities for people to discover what ministry is. Whereas, I don't know about you, but I mean, I was in smaller churches growing up, and I got to be on the worship team as a teenager. Where Church of
Yeah,
500, I'm not getting that opportunity. I mean, I had chances to share at a Sunday night youth service, where a church of 1,000 is not going to let me do that. And I feel like some of our best pastors grew up in smaller churches where they were invited to actually participate in what was going on, and that was a great benefit to them.
true. I would agree with you. As Joel and I were in youth ministry previously, in our ministry, small churches raise up a lot of leaders because they give them opportunity to serve at a young age and to practice their gifts and skills. And it's a great climate for that sort of thing for sure.
I mean, part of it is like not only you need them to serve. Like it's a lot of times like it's not just like what I mean. It's like you're a necessary part of the church. Like now, like we're needing your support and their input, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Turn with me to page 88. He's got this list that says, "Forget your troubles, come on and get healthy." Let me just highlight a few things that he writes here. He says, "I spent too many years trying to place blame for my and my church's failures, both real and imagined, on others. I blame my pastoral predecessors because they underbought and underbuilt. I blame demographic shifts in the community. I blame college professors." Then page 89, he says, "I blame myself. I'm not working hard enough. I'm not applying the right principles in the right way. I'm not in the right church, town, type of ministry to fulfill my calling. I'm not good enough. I missed God's calling." And then he writes a few paragraphs down. "I had to forget about the things I'm not and start appreciating the things I am." And this is kind of the highlight of what I circled here. Healthy churches do not grow under the guidance of disgruntled, demoralized pastors. One of the primary reasons for writing my story was to help other small pastors do what it took for me many years to do: stop being upset about what I'm not and start discovering and enjoying who I am. Boy, there's some real truth there about not getting so tied up into your identity about the size of things, and you can almost become upset about what you don't have and then neglect what you do have. And this spirit of blaming everyone and being angry, I mean, the Lord doesn't bless that. The churches can't grow under that sort of circumstances. What do you do then to, I guess, not let your identity, your image, be tied to numbers? Because I think we've all been there when there's like a really great Sunday and the place is packed, or the ministry that we're doing, lots of kids show up, or whatever it may be. Like we all feel good with the crowd. And then we've all been in those Sundays where there's way more seats looking back at us than there are people, where we put a lot of effort forth and it didn't go off like we thought, and now all of a sudden we're really angry and almost neglect the people that are there. I mean, how do you not tie your self-worth and to not get demoralized by these sorts of things and still stay positive? Anything that's out there that's you could share?
I'm a believer in finding your wins in the day.
Yeah, okay.
So, I'll take time each day after, and whether, a lot of times I'll have this big plan and that big plan doesn't go the way that I planned it to be.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
so I have to sit back and just go, okay, what was the win today? Because
yeah,
there are wins if we look for them and find them. But a lot of
yeah,
times we tend to look at what didn't go right instead of what did.
yeah.
When I have those days that are pretty discouraging, you feel like, man, I could have shot a shotgun and not hit anybody in the room. I
Yeah.
caught myself just kind of grumbling to the Lord, and He would get my attention, said, and would say in my heart, "Did you do what I asked you to do today?" And then
Mm-hmm.
be content with that. And
Yeah.
so the contentment that he talks about on the next page uh,
Yeah.
is so important for us, because if we're scrambling all the time, we're living in defeat, and we're living in Satan's victory area, and we don't want that for sure.
Yeah.
Mm.
Now, can we ask the opposite question? At what point do you become alarmed when the numbers keep slipping? Because I think we've all seen that too, where a church started going in decline and everyone said, "Oh, it's okay, everything's fine." And actually there were things that were not fine. And um you can almost lose so much momentum that now it's really, really hard to turn that ship around. I mean, at what point do you say, "Okay, like, we need to pay attention. Something's happening here, and we need to pinpoint what it is." I mean, have you been in that situation that you went, "Okay, this is becoming more than just we had a bad Sunday or 2 this month. We're actually seeing some significant decline." What does that look like?
Mm.
I, so I don't know if this answers your question or not, um, but I try to keep a very like if anybody ever asks me, how are you doing? My response is always
Mhm.
going to be that I'm blessed. Um, I may not be feeling good, or there may be terrible things that are going on, but
Yeah.
the truth is I'm blessed, not because I feel blessed, but because God has called me blessed.
Mhm.
And one of the dynamics in this, kind of getting to this idea, is, and I understand language is whatever, but I'm very careful in ever saying that this is my church, because it's
Oh,
not
yeah,
my church. It's not
yeah,
my congregation. It's God's church. They're God's
mm,
people, and He's called me to serve a particular role. And
yeah,
and so when either on, if there's a lot of people that are at that place on a certain Sunday, or a little bit of people, it's not going to necessarily change the emotions of it, but it does make me reflect on the stewardship of what I'm doing. And I think part of what Dave was saying, like, the if I can answer that at the end of the day, that I was faithful with what God has called me to do, then I'm okay. Um, if I'm not being faithful, and there's like a steady decline, and I'm just being lazy and not addressing whatever the issues are, then I don't feel
yeah,
like I'm probably being a good steward of what God's called me to do, and I better change some things or step out of the way and let
yeah,
God put the person in place that is going to do those things.
yeah, that's good. In the book, at one point, he talks about the church kind of understanding its mission, and then he references some things that he did that were, I would say, a little bit controversial. If you remember, at one point, they looked at their facility and said, one of the things we see is a lot of kids. Let's bring in some skate parks. Let's minister to youth, and that creates sometimes insurance problems. And you got youth loitering and hanging around the building, and yet his church really bought into that idea because they kind of understood a niche of what they're doing. And at least one of the themes I'm sensing as I read through this book is just because you're small doesn't mean that you don't have a purpose. And then trying to identify what is your purpose for your congregation. And I guess I'm curious uh, from anyone, but I know there's a couple of us that have been around for a long time, like Steve Leppert and Jason Evoy, Bob Sutton. Some of you have been at your churches for a really long time. How did you work through the process of saying, I think this is really what the thing that God's calling our church to do. This is kind of the identity of what's going on. I mean, anyone could speak into it, but I'm curious, especially some of you more long-term people.
Mm.
Well, unfortunately, I fall into the category of the guy that went to the conference and came back with a great idea. Because I went to the M25 conference back at the beginning of 2025. And
Uh-huh.
during that, God led
Yeah.
me to a few breakout sessions that specifically spoke to what my heart had been. And then he confirmed in me a call to bring that back to our church. And it's just now, it's only been, what, 10, 11 months. It's just now starting to catch on in the hearts of the people. But what it is in 2021, our community was terrorized by an arsonist. And we still have to this day people who still have rage in their hearts and who are still struggling, who don't sleep well, who are still fearful. Even though the guy was arrested and it's over with, it's been over with for 4 years. Um, and so God has put it on my heart that our church has got to establish a trauma recovery ministry. We are in the infancy stages, but I just had 16 people last weekend become certified as mental health first aid people. In the same way
Oh,
that you get certified as a CPR person or certified in first aid, these people are now certified as mental health first aid. And so we're prayerfully seeking what the next step is. But the whole point is that we want to try and be a place of health and emotional safety for people, and hopefully eventually point them to Christ as the source for their mental and emotional health. But the first start is to try to reach into that pain that they're experiencing.
yeah, that's good.
For us, we asked the question, where is the church not in our local
Yeah.
community?
Mm-hmm.
And the church was not in the accessibility arena at all. And so that's kind of the role that we fill within our community.
Yeah, that's good.
Mine was similar to what Bob said recently, though, only since really COVID. I went to NNU to the Wesley conference, and they had Todd Bolsinger was there speaking, and he did the Canoeing the Mountains book.
Yeah.
And so I didn't come back with like some new shiny thing. But what it did was reading that book with my church board, it was like, you have people who are wanting these action steps like immediately from every conversation that you have.
Yeah.
And then you have other people who just kind of want to talk about ideas forever and ever and ever and not do anything.
Mm-hmm.
But that book, it really helped us talk about anything, really. It was like, we may not have anything that comes out of this other than we're going to learn to actually talk about our strengths and our weaknesses and identify the reality of where our church is and who we are and who our community is and how the world is different. And that is what kind of sparked us on what we've been doing now, which is, I don't know, I've talked about to some people, but Mission 100, we call it. It was our 50th anniversary. So we started asking and talking to people about what did it look like for Nikiski Church of the Nazarene to continue helping people become passionate followers of Jesus in this community for another 50 years. And so that kind of conversation shifted from all of the little like, well, we don't have this thing for this group of people, and we don't have this little ministry totally filled up with everyone, and helped us truly kind of discover what our values were and who we have been all along, which has been an intergenerational church with like a very rich heritage with heavy emphasis with youth. Um, our people are super involved in the school systems and teachers and coaches, and so instead of trying to like set up program events, recognize how they already are involved and invested in the community and celebrate that rather than kind of make them feel like they have to add these new things on. And so blessing our community with just who we are and our presence, not to say like, oh, we're so great, but just by being
Yeah.
there. Those are kind of some of the things that we've been emphasizing recently, but really blessing the community. I think our church, we have a lot of disillusioned people have been in churches and disappeared for like a decade or two, have
Mm.
found a very welcoming place, like the journey of grace, Christ, like moving into wholeness and healing. That type of conversation doesn't really have a lot of places to go in Nikiski. Um, and that's been something that we have definitely made a part of who we are.
Yeah, I think you got to go through that process of defining what do we value before you really figure out what your niche is. I mean, you got to go through that process of, as a congregation, I just love what you're talking about, Jason, of trying to figure out what are the things that we as people are seem to be passionate about. It was hard for me to leave as a staff person. I mean, I was at a church that had full-time youth. I was full-time youth, full-time children's. We had, worship leader that was paid. I mean, a lot of paid staff, very staff heavy. So when I go to my first church to pastor and it runs 50, I'm like thinking in my head, well, we're going to have the best worship in town. We're going to have the best youth program, the best children's pastor. And I just remember the senior pastor pulled me aside and said, listen, the reality of being a church of 50, you're not going to have the best of everything. So his caution to me was rather than try to just do everything mediocre, like really figure out what's one thing you can do really well. And that really was a help to me to realize, that just because of church size, sometimes we aren't able to effectively do everything awesome, and that's all right. So what are the few things that we can do that's really really well? Before we get into this case study, I want to ask one more question because I'm interested in this. He talks about just reaching this place of burnout and where he's just kind of going through the motions. And if you'll remember, it was almost like an intervention of his board where they sent him away on the sabbatical. He's probably not going to keep pastoring if he didn't get that break. He was done and just so jaded. I think this is a problem for all of us. If we're honest, we stay in a place long enough and we can get jaded, we can get burned out. What are the things that you do as a safeguard to not get you to that place where you become angry, you become where you're just phoning it in? How do you stay away from this idea of burnout that he experienced? Any tips that you might share of what you do to preserve and keep longevity in ministry?
I try to leave as much as possible and have ChatGPT do all my sermons.
Do
No.
not follow Jason's advice.
I was going to say, I just preach whatever Jason preaches the week prior.
Yeah.
I've got to do some investigating, boys.
One of the things that our church has made available to me, although I have not taken advantage of it as much as I wish I could have, is I'm supposed to take 2 to 3 days every quarter for rest and recreation away from the
Yeah,
church, away. And so it hasn't happened every every quarter for 22 years, but it has happened. And I do
yeah,
it without guilt. I do it without any feeling like I'm cheating. It's not
yeah,
costing me any vacation time. It's just 3 days
yeah.
to just get away and
Mm,
just rest and recreate.
yeah, that's good.
I do think that I do go on like a week long prayer and planning retreat every year. And sometimes it's for planning out like the whole year, just more in general. And sometimes it's to try to plan very specific sermons for, some 3 month
Yeah.
chunk of time. But that
Hmm.
is really helpful. Truly, I know I joked about leaving as much as possible, but going to places with other pastors, like I
Yeah.
know it's hard for small churches to go to some of those things, but those have been very, very life giving to me. Um, Having conversations about books that people are reading, calling other pastors who aren't necessarily
Yeah.
in similar situations.
Hmm.
Those have been good things for me. And fishing, and
Yeah.
that's not a joke.
I think for me, it's recognizing that you're at a place where you're starting to get jaded.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and then asking some real questions. God, what's happening? What am I allowing to direct my thoughts and my attitude? Um, Giving Him freedom to give us direction. And I think a lot of what Jason has said and others, I think we have to find things that give us life. That's
Yeah.
what, for me, that's one of the things that just brings life because we're in the giving business, and
Mm.
it absorbs all of us, all the energy that we have at times. And so we have to have those times of renewal and refreshing and figuring out what it is that, really refreshes us and renews us. I think that's really important. And there for all of us, and there's different time frames for things. When I was in ministry in California, when he would say, "You need to ride your motorcycle more," she was that person that recognized very quickly, "You need to go a little further tonight on the bike," and get away and refresh and
Yeah.
reflect. And in recent years, it's been, for me, it's the fishing, it's being outdoors, running with a dog, watching a bird dog hunt. It's just finding those things for me. So my thought for all of us is we've got to find that. We've got to allow God to uh, allow us to see that, so that we can be in a place where we can be of benefit to people and not find ourselves jaded and
Mm.
not of benefit to the church that God has called us to.
That's good.
Yeah, Dave, in Cordova, I brought my motorcycle with me too, but 12 miles to the airport and back was not something that relaxed me.
I know, round and round and round you go. There's 53 miles there in Cordova, brother.
Huh?
There's 53 miles, or there was when I was there.
Yeah, it's just
I
that
know that
road.
because I'd get
Once
on the
you get,
bike and do it.
yeah, once you get past the airport, it's a golf course. It's holes everywhere. It's pretty bad. You remember that going out to the bridge, the $1 million bridge, and it's just so bad on your car.
Hunter, one of the things that I do is I mean, I do think we have to have the rhythms of getting away. But one of the things I try to do in my work is it's like a daily thing. And I find it happens often when I'm getting called or paged to something that I know is going to be hard. And so I do little things. I change the rhythm of how I walk. I actually intentionally will slow down. I'll do a
Mm.
stutter step. I'll do something that breaks me out of my usual rhythm so that I'm fully attentive to like what's going on for myself. And then it's like, God, I need you in this moment because what I'm going into will be hard. And I think that that's maybe one of the things we do is we recognize as we start getting to that point of not being curious anymore about people
Mm.
and we become jaded is we just change your rhythm and just be fully present so you can recognize like what's going on and ask God and be curious about not only others but about ourselves. And I always love all the things of getting away, but I'm also trying to figure out in the rhythm of my everyday life,
Mm.
how am I and what are the things that I'm doing that give space when I recognize that I'm getting impatient or my curiosity and my kindness are not there. And so that's one of the things I do is I literally will change the rhythm of how I walk.
Mm. Yeah, I find even sometimes just like intentionally slowly breathing and taking like deep breaths before something also does that same kind of situation where, yeah, no, that's good. Yeah. Well, I'm going to read this case study for you. This is made up, so this isn't somebody on the district. We've got a generic pastor here. We're going to help figure out how we can help this generic pastor out. And this is what it says. Pastor Bud has served Littleton First Church of the Nazarene, located in a small rural community in Alaska, for the last 10 years. When he arrived, the congregation averaged about 35 people on Sunday morning. Through steady preaching, compassionate community involvement, and a heart for discipleship, the church gradually grew to around 75 regular attendees by year 7. Littleton first became known as a caring, family oriented congregation. They hosted annual community dinners, vacation Bible schools, a food pantry, and Pastor Bud and his wife were deeply loved by the congregation and known for their hospitality and warmth. Over the last 3 years, attendance has slowly dropped from 75 to around 45. Several key families have moved away due to job changes or retirement. A few have been attending larger churches in the nearby city where children and youth ministries are more developed. The COVID impact has had lingering effects, leaving many people to not return in person. And Pastor Bud feels as though his energy and creativity were spent just trying to keep things afloat during those challenging years. Now ministry feels heavy. He's preaching faithfully, visiting the sick, and keeping ministry running, but it feels like pushing a boulder uphill. Discouragement and fatigue, Bud feels his best efforts no longer make a difference. He sometimes looks at other pastors' and ministries and wonders why their churches seem to be thriving while his struggles. He prays and studies regularly. His devotion life feels more like a duty than a source of renewal. And the nearest Nazarene pastor is over an hour away, so he struggles to have meaningful peer connection that's very rare. As we think about Pastor Bud's situation, first of all, what are some possible underlying causes of church decline beyond just church attendance? That's one thing we're going to look at. What are some steps Bud can take to renew his personal spiritual life and reignite his sense of calling? And in what ways can the church congregation and come alongside him, and what small wins could they experience? So you kind of get this sense he's been there for 10 years, he's been there for a while, they had some growth, it's been in decline, there's a frustration there. What would you tell Pastor Bud in this situation?
Hmm. Call your DS.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't tell him to go to your DS. That's
This is an
yeah.
older, would it be different if it was somebody much older or somebody younger or start out, or do you think that would have an effect on the way they would
Sure.
process it?
Yeah, I think so. Sure.
Hmm.
My thought it has been that as you were talking about that is, wouldn't it be wonderful if, and I'm not putting this on our district superintendent, but wouldn't it be wonderful if the district on which Pastor Bud served had an intentional ministry where someone who was watching those statistics
Mm,
recognized something was going on and made a connection between another pastor and Pastor Bud. In other words, it wasn't because like if somebody's grieving, if somebody has had a death, and you come up to them and say, "Just let me know if there's anything I can do for you," they're not
right.
going to give you anything. But if you'll
Right.
come and wash their dishes, they're going to greatly appreciate it. And in that same way, if the district superintendent has in place, and I'm not talking about you personally doing it, but
Sure.
if you have in
Sure.
place a situation of watching and you see, hey, there's a decline going on over here. Hey, Pastor Stephen Sheets, who has had an incredible year
Mm,
of ministry and compassion, why don't you give a phone call or invite Joe out for lunch or whatever the case may be, and then
yeah.
and make that connection. Let somebody reach out to him as opposed to um, him trying to figure out what.
Yeah. That's good.
I think there was a time, the people have been here longer than me, where I think we had pastors calling other pastors to see how they were doing.
Mm,
Is my memory, is that somewhere else or was that here?
No, that was here. We used to do that. Yeah.
I can remember my early years getting phone calls from somebody, and my first thought, of course, is what's the matter? What I do? No. Yeah, but they used to call and ask how we were doing. What can we pray for?
The
So,
district
Pastor
advisory
Stephen, was
board.
that organic, or that was something that was expected of pastors on the district? I guess Pastor Barber can share that too. But where did that come from?
So primarily that came from Pastor Paul, and that was the role of members of the district advisory board, and they would call
Sure.
and check on pastors. So, and I remember calling Pastor Steve there a couple of times, and he definitely did sound like, "Oh no, what did I do? What's wrong?"
When they send in the big guns, I got to be concerned. Now, if Joe had called me, I'd say, "Hey, Goomba, how you doing?" No, Joe's been a great help to me. So,
I think one of the other things I would do is I was always really fortunate to have really like a lot of other great pastors in the community that were rocking it for the kingdom.
Yeah.
And didn't matter the size of the church, they loved
Mhm.
Jesus. And maybe that's one of those things where other pastors, like connecting with other pastors in the community would be beneficial because they kind of get the community. I mean, they probably have experienced people moving away as well, or whatever, some of the scenario you shared, they understand that space,
Mhm.
and they're right there. And so that's one of the things um that I would hope is in that community and in all of our communities, really. I mean, I think we all need each other bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my initial thought, right, wrong, or indifferent, is self-care. And I don't know Pastor Bud because he's a fictitious character in our story.
Yeah.
But just from what you're saying, I begin to wonder, has he cared for himself over the
Mm.
past 7 to 10
Mhm.
years? Has he
Yeah.
had, and again, these are, I'm not saying that this is a silver bullet and this solves all the problems, but has he taken a
Yeah.
sabbatical? Has the
Yeah.
church board worked with him to make sure that he's had rest, that he's
Mm.
had opportunities to recharge himself? Because it feels to me like he's at a point where he's starting to care less, just
Yeah.
from the way you read that. And
Yeah.
sometimes that's where I'm struggling with something internally and I need some time away to fix that, and might need some help fixing that too.
Yeah.
But self-care is the first thing that came to my mind as you read that scenario.
But, I agree with all of that, but it may also be that he needs to spend some time figuring out if God still has him there
Yeah.
too. It's not always about just trying to stay. Um, but maybe, I don't know, that's hard to figure out how to have conversations about though.
Yeah.
Here's an encouraging thing about Pastor Bud. His church is averaging 10 more than when he came. He sent
Yeah.
20 some people away to outside of the community to other churches, and the
Mhm.
other people that have left and stayed in the community are still in church. So the
Yeah.
kingdom of God has continued to grow, and his church actually has grown over the 10-year period as well.
Yeah. That's a great point.
Although it can be
Num-
discouraging.
Yeah, and I mean numerically that's the case, but clearly there's something else going on
Yeah.
that is causing other feelings of discouragement and disillusionment that somehow he needs to walk through.
Yeah.
Right, but I think sometimes because we do have a focus on numbers uh,
Mm.
a lot, that when we do see, man, I was running 75, I was running 80, and now I'm down to 55, and it's been 3 years, that's going to affect if that's where we get our feedback from, and that's not a
Yeah.
healthy way to get feedback, but that is going to impact us.
Yeah. That's true. Well, this has been a great discussion. I put in the chat the learning code, so if you're keeping track of those, you can put that number in there. We've got some great things coming up next month. We're best practices. We're going to talk about outreach, just ways we engage community, and then our next book is the Circle Maker, just another great book on prayer. So hopefully you'll join us for that. Um, I'm going to stop the recording.